European companies are fleeing US-based public cloud providers. Why is this happening? Let's talk about it. So welcome to the Cloud Computing Insider. This channel explores the ins and outs of cloud computing without an agenda or following into the narrative set by big tech marketing. We look at what works and what does not, and the actual value of this technology in a balanced and information-forward way. If that interests you, please subscribe, like, and comment. I'm your host, David Linthicum, author, speaker, cloud and AI architect, top 10 cloud and AI influencer, B-list geek, and over-the-hill mountain biker. Let's get started. So you guys love the kicking to the cloud, to the curb videos, which I've done a few times, probably maybe 5 or 6 videos over the last year and a half. And you can check out the one that gets all the hits above. But I can see why you're normally not seeing the message out there in terms of how we're looking at moving away from the public cloud providers, versus the last 15 years where everybody was moving to the public cloud providers. And obviously that's kind of contrarian to the narrative that's out there right now, even though people are a little bit more open to it. And so it does get me in trouble. I do hear from their press people, even though I'm not a member of the press, but they obviously would rather me not spread that message. So from the register, Europe's cloud customers are eyeing exit from US hyperscalers. And I'll put a link to the article in the description. So from them, it's amazing how fast the change has occurred. And the article is up on your screen, and the link, as I said, is in the description. Check it out, because that is kind of unique reporting based on what else I'm seeing out there as to the message. So the European organizations are increasingly questioning their reliance on US hyperscalers like AWS, Microsoft, and Google amid growing geopolitical tensions and uncertainty. At April's KubeCon EU event, discussions highlighted a surging interest in alternative cloud providers driven by several pressing concerns, such as unreliable US policies, escalating pricing due to tariffs, and the fear of espionage. The unprecedented nature of these decisions under the leader of our president has amplified the urgency for companies to protect their operations and data for potential disruptions. And so what's going on out there right now, and Europe is always been a bit skeptical of US-based technology. You remember the Google, the Google cars driving around, taking pictures, doing geotagging on the streets and things like that, were being pushed back on. They're a little bit more, understandably so in some instances, not as trustworthy as I think we are in the States. And so they push back on US-based technology, even though they adopt much of it, and they certainly have adopted the use of cloud technology. And there's lots of points of presence there for Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. And they've been, over the last 15 years, using a growing number of public cloud services. But what recently occurred is they've been questioning that, is that their viable future, or do they need to seek other alternatives? And that's what this is about. So prominent figures like Mark Booth, CEO of UK-based Civil, and Frank Kershenk, excuse me if I messed that up, of Nextcloud, noted a sharp rise in inquiries about sovereign cloud services. Customers fear the US administration's ability to abruptly cut off services, accessing confidential data, or impose unforeseen regulations. These concerns are paired with frustrations over dominant, oligopoly of US providers who hold approximately 70% of Europe's cloud market. And so the suspicion is, and I can see where it's coming from, in other words, they're in countries where they have no political influence over the United States, at least other than, trade agreements and trade talks. And obviously there's a big bunch of stuff that's going on right now that I'm not getting into. And so they feel the lack of control is putting risk on these environments that they're trusting. And so in other words, if they're trusting the public cloud providers to operate their data and operate their applications, and certainly with the growing use of AI, we're picking cloud platforms now, are picking who the winners are going to be. They're not necessarily as attracted as much to US-based cloud providers because of some of those risks. And so they can't control it. They're concerned about changing policies. They're concerned about espionage. They're concerned about privacy issues, and they have particular needs and compliance needs in those particular countries. So they're looking for other alternatives. They're looking either to bring it back in-house and run it within their own data centers, or probably more likely moving it to a European-based managed service provider or a sovereign cloud that operates in Europe, like Lidl in Germany, something like that. So they're just considering the alternatives because of the value that the public cloud providers that the US-based public cloud providers have had over the years seems to be diminished. It's around cost, it's around regulations, it's around some of the risks that many of these European companies are not willing to take anymore. So transitioning away, however, isn't easy. Migration timelines often span months or years, requiring a phased strategic approach. Yet, motivated by fears of losing control over their data, some organizations are seeking rapid moves as geopolitical shifts create significant anxiety. Leaders argue this could accelerate Europe's push toward building a sovereign, competitive cloud ecosystem, offering alternatives to US-based dominance. And we certainly are seeing this today. And I talked about Lidl, the grocery store that has a public cloud offering in Germany right now. They're becoming amazingly popular, but there's other sovereign cloud offerings in the European countries, France, Germany, Italy, things like that. They're becoming very attractive for the companies that are there for the reasons, that we mentioned. And so I see that being a large area of growth. We talked about the alt cloud providers on this show many times, sovereign cloud providers, specialized cloud providers like CoreWeave and Lambda Labs and things like that to do AI-based clouds. And in many instances, these alternatives are going to be much cheaper, which is a very important part of this, but also come with the appearance, that's probably the best way to say it right now, that there's going to be lower risk around compliance, lower risk around espionage, or the big thing would be lower risk around, some kind of a geopolitical upheaval that occurs in the States, where much of the workloads and much of the data that they spent so many years cultivating end up having to move from those platforms suddenly. So the geopolitical impact on cloud dependency is a huge issue, as we just mentioned. So with the rising geopolitical tensions, enterprises are reconsidering their reliance on the US-based cloud hyperscalers. And these decisions about cloud providers are no longer just technical. In other words, everything works on most of the cloud providers that are out there, but it becomes strategic and political decisions for the future of business operations. So in other words, they're not looking at the issue, does this work or not? Almost all of these cloud providers will work just fine. They're worried about the risk in dealing with that particular provider in terms of having controls over prices, legal issues, espionage, everything we just talked about. So the enterprises are concerned about, policies, unpredictability under, varying U.S. administrations impacting the long-term stability of cloud operations. And so there's reasons for that to happen. In other words, they're changing very quickly, and they're concerned about changes being made that puts their workloads and their data sets at risk. So the risks of restrictive executive orders, such as potential data access modifications, leads organizations to explore alternatives that offer stronger data sovereignty assurances, which is understandable. In other words, they have to operate in that country, and they want to make sure they have a cloud partner that's able to support them. And proactive cloud migration planning, including diversification to non-US providers, minimizes exposures to these geopolitical risks. So we're not seeing this massive movement where everybody's going to move everything off of AWS, Microsoft, and Google, and certainly the European clouds are going to be among that. They're looking at alternatives now. And so as they're building these net new workloads, such as AI, which takes a tremendous amount of processing power, tremendous amount of storage, and costs a lot of money, the public cloud providers, the hyperscalers, the US-based hyperscalers, the big three, aren't necessarily the default decisions anymore. So in other words, they're looking at alternatives, and for good reasons. The alternatives work just fine, as we mentioned earlier. And in many instances, they cost about half as much. And so if you're there to build reliable systems that are going to cost the least and return the most value, in many cases, the public cloud providers, which used to be the go-to just a few years ago, are going to be something that's going to be contraindicated. That's just the reality of it. So also the data sovereignty issue is emerging as a top priority for organizations. globally, especially in Europe, as companies rethink where their operational data resides, which is very important to them and how they deal with regulations. Enterprises now actively question who controls their data, which is a good thing to do, and the associated risks of external access. In other words, they're concerned about controlling their data and make sure other people aren't able to control their data from outside the companies, like law enforcement organizations, things like that. So the European companies are focusing on avoiding compliance entanglements, like the U.S. Cloud Act, which raises concerns about government's access to sensitive business data stored by U.S. providers. So the scary thing for them is they don't control these law enforcement organizations. So if they're able to go into those cloud providers and look at their data, that's obviously going to be a risk. And they view that as unacceptable, and they should. Interest in European cloud providers and open source platforms such as Nextcloud and OpenStack is intensifying. So private clouds are coming back into vogue, as we talked about here on the show before, due to their sovereignty focused positioning. In other words, they're able to focus on a particular country. That's where they operate in, and they're going to support clients in that country. So choosing these sovereign alternatives ensures compliance with some of the EU data protection laws like GDPR, which foster trust and security across international business operations. So simple policies here. So in other words, they want to deal with sovereign cloud providers, people that are just operating a cloud platform in their own country, and they're going to get the benefits of leveraging a public cloud provider, but they're also going to deal with a provider who knows the laws and is able to purpose build a platform that's able to deal with the particular narrow requirements of operating in that particular European country, or any country for that matter. And so that's why we're seeing these come into vogue. Small cloud providers, and obviously they don't have all of the services that an AWS, Microsoft, or Google has, but in many cases, these cloud users are just looking to use the minimum viable services. They're just looking for platforms, operating systems, storage systems, and not looking for the add-on services. They're not looking for serverless. They're not looking for some of the higher-end AI stuff. They just want to operate their workloads in a way that's going to make them scalable and always on. So the next thing would be pricing. How much money does this cost? So cloud pricing models have become a critical pain point for businesses relying on U.S. hyperscalers, especially with the new tariff implications and licensing cost increases. And we're not going to get into that here. You need to look at your own situation. The economic predictability of cloud services is becoming just as important as their technical capabilities. So maybe it's without warrant, or in other words, there's no reason for them to fear this, but they're concerned about policy changes are going to kick up the prices even more where they are now. And right now, public cloud providers are very expensive. They're not the cheap alternatives like they were a few years ago. So tariffs and unstable pricing structures highlight the need for enterprises, to mitigate business risk by reducing dependencies on some of the monopolistic providers out there. Obviously, they're talking about the big three public cloud providers out of the state. And there's recent examples that includes Microsoft licensing costs increases post-Broadcom VMware acquisition underscore the vulnerability of customers under constrained provider options. And so organizations should focus on diversifying providers and adopting multi-cloud strategies to retain flexibility in pricing negotiation leverage. And so the message there is that there's always going to be risks that come with leveraging any platform, whether it's a sovereign cloud or a major hyperscaler like Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. And you have to look at the risks, and you have to look at the potential downsides of using a particular platform. And very much it's going to be associated with cost. So the concern would be if you're giving power to a hyperscaler that's going to be running your workloads in perpetuity, then the big question would be, how are the prices going to rise or fall over the next 10, 15, 20 years? Because you're going to be locked into that particular provider for a long period of time, and it's going to be uneconomically viable for you to move off of that platform. Therefore, that lock-in is going to come with a certain amount of cost. If their prices go way up and you have no alternatives as to where you can move to other platforms in some sort of an economical viable way. So in other words, you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. You're damned if you stay on the platform and the prices go way up and you're paying way more for that infrastructure versus what you thought you would pay many years ago. And I write about that in my Insiders book. And the other thing would be that if you want to move off that cloud provider, it's going to cost you many millions of dollars to move those applications, move that data, off to a different cloud provider or even a private cloud, on-prem systems, things like that. And there's risk in doing that, lots of cost in doing that. So there's a reason, I think, why these companies are concerned. So next would be shifting trust in cloud infrastructure. So the recent reports of espionage risk and confidential database, explorations, hacking, businesses are becoming cautious about the integrity of their cloud infrastructures. Data security concerns are no longer confined to cyber attacks, but extend to the very platforms hosting the enterprise information. So the concern there, and I think it is in many cases, it's unwarranted if we're going to be honest here, is that the cloud providers themselves are going to become the point of vulnerability. So in other words, there's going to be something or some event that occurs on those providers, either law enforcement, driven, looking at people's data, things like that, where their data is going to somehow be exposed. Now, normally that shouldn't concern as many people as it does, because if you're encrypting your data in the cloud, there's typically no way that they can see it. At least that's the idea. But I understand the concerns. So the concerns about data, exposure or misuse, especially following industry reports of questionable access practices, drive businesses to seek providers with transparent data governance policies. And so, again, going to sovereign providers because they're going to be a bit more open about how they control their workloads and how they control their data. So increased demand for sovereign cloud solutions reflects businesses' efforts to protect their intellectual property and sensitive data from third-party interference. So if you're afraid of your cloud provider, you're going to use a cloud provider, you're going to be less afraid of your sovereign cloud provider. I think that's what they're saying. So trust building within the cloud landscape necessitates strict controls over where the data is stored, processed, and how the data is monitoring. So we're trying to get to a cloud infrastructure that we can trust. You got to remember, this public cloud provider stuff has always been about trust. We're going to trust somebody else to take care of our workloads, to host our data, to host our processes. And if trust is diminishing, which it seems like it is, either for true reasons or not true reasons, it's happening, then that's the reason that many of these enterprises, certainly in the European theaters, are making the move. So what about migrating from hyperscalers? Well, enterprises should tread carefully when moving away from hyperscalers. It's going to be expensive and it's going to be risky. While the process can be beneficial in the long run, it requires strategic planning, time allocation, and robust governance to mitigate risks during the migration. So if we're mitigating risks as we move into the cloud, but also we need to mitigate risks as we're repatriating from the cloud. So there's just as many risks that involve, and it has to be managed professionally. Migration times can stretch into months or even years. Believe me, these things go off in many years in some instances, necessitating methodical, phased approach to minimize operational disruptions and maintain service continuity. So you have to cut over stuff. You have to figure out, how to implement it, test it, things like that. And identifying trusted providers with the appropriate infrastructure and compliance capabilities ultimately is a prerequisite for successful cloud migrations. And in some instances, some of these alternative cloud providers will assist you in migrating to their platforms from the larger hyperscalers. Adopting approaches like hybrid clouds, which allow partial migrations while maintaining connectivity to legacy systems, can provide the best of both worlds, and they can reduce risk and ease some of the transitions. Again, good architecture saves you here, and good planning saves you here. And so whether you're moving to a public cloud provider, off a public cloud provider, moving from a public cloud provider to another public cloud provider like a sovereign cloud or a managed service provider, or even a co-location provider, to mitigate those risks, there has to be careful planning. And you need to employ people who understand what they're doing, because there's lots of moving parts, there's lots of complexity, and I see those projects go off the rail all the time. So where's all this stuff going? Well, contrary to popular belief, alternatives to hyperscalers are emerging rapidly, and they're being fueled by technological innovations and geopolitical motivations. So the next generation of cloud will likely move beyond some of the monopolistic control toward a more diverse ecosystem. So instead of concentrating on 3 major cloud providers, we're going to put it on dozens and dozens of providers and dozens of on-prem and public cloud alternatives. European and global innovators are driving the creation of open infrastructure platforms like OpenStack to challenge the dominant hyperscalers out there. So we're seeing these cloud platforms that are emerging. We cover them a lot here. And they are having an impact on providing alternatives to some of the hyperscalers out there. The rapid growth in customer interest indicates a shift from consolidating in existing monopolistic cloud platforms to building resilient, diverse cloud ecosystems that are providing alternatives to these hyperscalers. Technological growth and increased regulations could enable smaller, trusted cloud providers to gain a foothold, and we're seeing this growing like crazy, fostering competition and reducing dependency on incumbent hyperscalers. So this is really kind of nothing against the hyperscalers. They obviously have a business to run, and they're going to run the business that's going to bring the most value in, because their job as a business is to return shareholder equity or maximize the return of shareholder equity. And so they're going to make the moves that are in their best interest. So I don't kind of blame them for that. But if you're operating out, if you're a company or an enterprise and you're becoming dependent on this technology, I also don't blame you for looking at the alternatives out there and being suspicious in terms of where the future of this stuff is going. We're already seeing the public cloud providers that are costing way more than we thought they were going to cost. It's 2.5 times, as I wrote about in my book. And I think that's only going to carry on. I don't think it's going to get any cheaper. And I'm going to do a show upcoming on why the cloud prices are so high and some of the reasons behind that. But if we see lower cost alternatives and they're able to meet our requirements, in other words, we're not using the 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 cloud services that are on these hyperscalers, we're just using the basic systems, platform, storage, compute, things like that, then many of these alternative platforms are going to work out just fine, and they're going to run at about half the cost, and they may even reduce some of the risks that we talked about during the show. So I urge you to do your own math, do your own analysis, do your own requirements, trying to figure out what you need, and then focus on leveraging and obtaining the minimum viable platform, the platform that's going to serve your requirements, but not overserve them, and the platform that's going to minimize cost and maximize value that's being returned to the business. And that's what it's all about. Oh, another long one with this one. It's a pretty meaty topic, so I hope you enjoyed this. And let me know in the comments below if you want to hear shorter content or longer content. Happy to provide either. So don't forget to like and subscribe. Check out my other videos on this channel. Also check out my InfoWorld blog and also my 100+ LinkedIn learning courses. And of course, my generative AI architecture course out on Go Cloud Careers. My other YouTube show, AI Insights Innovation, on the Cube Research YouTube channel. And finally, my latest book, An Insider's Guide to Cloud Computing. So until next week, stay very safe. Later.